Hello again, and welcome to the fourth instalment of The Conquered and the Proud. And as I explained last time, our theme in this talk is going to be Roman imperialism, and we're going to try and understand what were the mechanisms behind it all, what were the causes, why did it happen, and in doing that we're going to have to look at different views of scholars in different generations and how they've seen this and how their own environment, the nature of their own world, its assumptions has affected how they go and look at the Roman evidence. But let's go back to Polybius and begin there, because there's a nice quote near the very start of his Universal History. And this is as follows: "For who is so worthless or indolent as not to wish to know by what means and under what system of polity the Romans, in less than 53 years, have succeeded in subjecting nearly the whole inhabited world to their sole government, a thing unique in history? Or who again is there so passionately devoted to other spectacles or studies as to regard anything as of greater moment than the acquisition of this knowledge?" Rome's dominance was a shock, particularly to people in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Greek world. After all, this is the world that's still living with the echoes of Alexander the Great's great conquest, and not only had he overrun southern Greece with Philip his father, but then they'd gone off and carved their way off to India, to the very edges of the world. Now, in Polybius' day, the Romans had gone nowhere near those sorts of distances. They'd gone to Asia Minor, but not really much further than that. Nevertheless, for Polybius, the centre of the world is his own Greek world, centred around the Mediterranean, for him particularly the eastern half. But in 146, Corinth had been sacked by the Romans. In the same year, they had destroyed Carthage, the ancient, once mighty and very powerful trading empire established on the North African coast by Phoenician settlers. So the Romans had shown their dominance, their power, in that time in a way that was shocking to the audience that Polybius felt he was addressing, and to Greeks like himself. They couldn't really understand this. How had these Western barbarians done all of this? So that's going to be our theme today, trying to look at how and why this all happened. And we'll come back to Polybius more than once. But let's begin with another incident that follows on from some of the things we talked about last time when we were looking at the wars between the Romans and the Macedonians and the Seleucid Empire of Asia Minor, Syria and beyond. Now, if you remember, Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, one of the most successful and famous of the Seleucid kings, had intervened in Greece in 193 BC, prompted a Roman response. His expeditionary force was defeated at Thermopylae, again, that famous set of passes that has featured so often in history because that's the way the land forces you to travel. The Romans had then, in 190 BC, sent Lucius Cornelius Scipio, brother of the famous Scipio Africanus, the man who'd won the Second Punic War in Spain, who defeated Hannibal at Zama in 202 BC, and who accompanied his brother as sort of advisor, technical expert. He was sent there, and after various delays, managed to defeat Antiochus III at the Battle of Magnesia. And it was a colossal defeat, the sort that meant that for at least a while, Antiochus was not going to be able to raise an army on the scale of the size necessary to confront the Romans again. That's even if he felt his men had the confidence to do that. So it really was a knockout blow, although the war didn't immediately end, but it was fairly clear to everybody that Antiochus had been beaten and that the probability was that peace would follow. This was a disappointing truth to Gnaeus Manlius Vulso, one of the consuls of 189 BC, the following year, who was allocated the province of the war against Antiochus as his military command. By the time he arrived to replace Lucius Cornelius Scipio, Scipio had not finalized the peace treaty, and there was a 10-man senatorial commission had come out partly to negotiate that. So the war was technically still going, but everybody could see it was really over, that Antiochus didn't want to fight again. Now, for Vulso, this meant that he'd missed the greatest opportunity of his lifetime. He'd become consul, he'd been praetor just a few years before. This is a big moment for him, it's his big chance, and he'd been allocated by lot, as these things were usually done, the command in Asia, the command against Antiochus, the command in the biggest, the most famous, the most exciting war that the Romans had ongoing at the time, and one fought in the mysterious, exotic, and fabulously wealthy East, where you could expect to make a huge profit. So all of this tantalizing prospect of he would be the man who would actually defeat Antiochus, he'd take over from Scipio and he would win the war because Scipio had been faffing about for a year and hadn't really achieved anything, that is dashed when Vulso arrives on the spot and takes command of the army. Now, Vulso was not a man to take defeats like this lying down, so he tried to provoke Antiochus by being aggressive, making more demands, marching his army close to Seleucid territory and trying to sort of say, you know, come on, have a go if you think you're hard enough, that sort of thing. He's trying to provoke, he's hoping that Antiochus will risk another battle and that Vulso will win that battle and that he can then say, well, I was the one who won the war. Yeah, Scipio did some work, but basically it's all down to me. And think back to some of the triumphal monuments and celebrations that we talked about in the second of this series, where the Romans loved to enumerate their successes. You know, I defeated so many men, I captured so many cities, this was the amount of plunder, these were the tribes, the peoples, the cities, the kings who submitted to me. Ending the war brought immense glory. And again, if you think back to the talk we did last time on the the Macedonian and the Syrian wars, in 198 BC, Flamininus, the man in charge of the war against Philip V of Macedon, was willing to give the king very favourable terms when he thought that he was going to be replaced by another consul and therefore he didn't want someone else to get the credit for ending the war. Better to have a victory that wasn't entirely satisfactory but was yours, rather than have somebody else go and complete the war, perhaps for the greater good of the Republic, but they're getting the credit for it. So Vulso tries to provoke Antiochus III and fails. The king is not going to be drawn. He obviously realizes the situation. He can see blatantly what Vulso is trying to do, and he's probably also has had enough contact with the other Roman commissioners, with their envoys, to see that there isn't really appetite in Rome for a continuation of the war. As far as the Romans are concerned, it's all gone marvelously well. We've won. Let's get out of here with a good peace treaty that makes that the Seleucids know their place. And if we go back last time, sorry for that crash in the background, but the two cats are playing up and knocking plates around trying to find food that doesn't exist. So, facing predatory cats on the one side, because Augustus has been joined by his sister Artemisia, and it's hard to tell which one's more likely to knock things down, but nevertheless, apologies for this interruption, but as I've said before, it's very hard to control cats, and if I shut the door, they'll just be yelling outside it for attention, which is probably even less of a sympathetic background to a talk like this. So let's go back to Vulso. He's tried to pick a fight with Antiochus III and failed. The Seleucids are not going to be drawn. The king is not going to renew the war and suffer an even worse defeat. He reckons the best chance he's got for a decent peace treaty is actually now. In fact, the Romans will impose very harsh terms on him, but not ones that he can't cope with. You know, these are ones with which he can accept, he can live with them, he can deal with them. And as you always tend to think in these situations, most people think, well, maybe in a few years' time, I can build up my power again and, you know, we can set things right. Doesn't need to be a confrontation, but just I can, you know, yes, this is a temporary loss. It doesn't have to be a permanent loss, but let's give myself some time to recover. So he can't fight the Seleucids because they won't come out and play. Instead, Manlius Vulso starts to march his army around Asia Minor, threatening various cities and extorting money from them. And at one point, there's a nice little incident that illustrates ancient attitudes to warfare and just how different they are to many of our modern assumptions. Here we go. On the third day's march from there, he, that's Manlius Vulso, reached Tabai. That region had suffered no impairment of its strength, and in consequence, its men were eager for a fight. Soon, it became apparent that they were no match for the Romans, either in numbers or in soldierly qualities, and they were driven back into the town. Then they begged forgiveness for their mistaken behaviour and were ready to surrender their city. The consul demanded of them 25 talents of silver and 10,000 medimni of wheat, and their surrender was accepted on those terms. It's a very interesting incident because what appears to have happened is the Roman advance guard came in sight of some of the population of this place called Tabai. And the locals looked at the Romans and they thought, well, there don't seem to be too many of them. And there's a lot of us and we're really brave and we don't know much about these Romans, but they're not necessarily braver than us. You know, who's going to be? These are an unknown quantity, these are foreigners, and they look as if they've got stuff that we might like. So they decide on a whim, without any particular reason, to go out and fight the approaching Roman army. Now, you could say any army approaching is viewed as potentially, even probably hostile until proved otherwise. So you can see there's an element of reasonableness about their reaction. But the locals go out, they fight the Romans, and more of the Roman army starts arriving because it's a lot bigger army than they thought. And the Romans are organized, and they prove to be very, very good at fighting. Remember, this is the army that's defeated Antiochus just the year before. It's got a lot of very experienced soldiers and officers. This is a time when the army of this system, this militia conscript system, is probably close to its peak in the years immediately after the Second Punic War. So the Romans fight back, and the inhabitants of Tabai start to do badly, start to get defeated, think, uh-oh, these people are a lot stronger than we thought. So we've got to reassess things. Instead of thinking, these are vulnerable, these are weak, but they've got nice things, let's pick on them, get the glory, get the plunder, get the prestige, and show how brave we are, and frighten anybody else from ever messing with us, to realizing, oops, nope, they're a lot stronger than we thought. So instead it's, oh, I'm terribly sorry, I didn't realize you were strong, can't we be friends? And they negotiate and they accept the treaty and the terms imposed upon them, which means giving a substantial amount of silver and of wheat to feed the Roman soldiers. The thing that's striking in this is the readiness with which they go to war. And they fight somebody they don't really know and against whom they don't really have an existing casus belli, any reason to fight. It's just a sense of opportunity. In the same way that Vulso is wandering around just finding people he can victimize, fight and plunder, the locals have thought, yeah, actually we can deal with these Romans. They're not too strong, so let's fight them, let's win, let's get the glory. And then they realize they're wrong. So it's, whoa, we better not deal with this. So let's get out of this the best way we can. So let's submit. So again, it's that willingness to go to war. Now, this is something we'll have to come back to time and time again in this discussion because it is a very significant element. But this is not war as we would understand it in the modern world, where you would expect there to be more reasoning and more negotiating before violence happens, rather than simply people sensing an opportunity, thinking, oh, I'll have a go at this, and then deciding, oh, no, not a good time, not a good opportunity, they're much tougher than we thought, so let's go and make peace with them. Now, Manlius Vulso goes off and he manages to pick a fight with the Galatians of Central Asia Minor, sort of the highlands of Turkey today. Now, these are the descendants of, well, they're associated in 3 tribes, but Gauls from France, as it is today, who have migrated in the 3rd century BC. In 278, they were plundering Greece, and then they decide to keep moving and pass on into Asia Minor. Now, it's not entirely clear whether this was a migration from the start or whether this was a large band or several bands of warlords with their warriors who were seeking plunder. So to what extent the whole family's coming with them? Probably a mix of both, and in many cases, but they've settled down, they have gone around plundering their neighbours, running a protection racket, extorting money from the neighbours around them. The kingdom of Pergamum in Asia Minor has done rather well by defeating them a generation or 2 back, and that's helped them to build up their power and separate away and remain independent from the Seleucids. Pergamum has been a useful ally of Rome up to this point. So again, they're an established enemy of Roman allies, but they're people that, other than serving as allies, auxiliary troops in the Seleucid army and as mercenaries, have not actually had any contact with the Romans in any other respect. There isn't, again, a reason for war outside of the one they'd fought on the side of Antiochus, so you could say they're part of that same peace treaty, really, or expected to be. But Vulso doesn't see it that way. He picks a fight with them. The Gauls take him up on it. They're willing to fight, and he defeats them in battle and plunders them and takes lots of slaves. Now, as with all the wars, again, we emphasized this in the last talk, the Romans are being backed by allies from the region, but also from further afield. So Philip V of Macedon had helped to negotiate with the Thracian tribes to protect the land route the Roman army would use when Scipio took it to Asia Minor in the first place, because they went basically along over the land until they got to the Dardanelles and crossed the narrowest point. They didn't go by sea all the way across the Aegean and land on the coast there. They went by the shortest distance possible over water. And because Philip had bribed, threatened, and generally worked with the chieftains and kings of the Thracians, they weren't molested. Now, Vulso doesn't seem to have been the most tactful of individuals, didn't treat Philip with sufficient respect. This process doesn't happen on the return journey. So the Roman army, with all its wagons full of plunder and other swag that it's taken from extorting from the cities, and in particular from the Galatians, gets attacked, gets robbed to a fair degree. Now, the extent to which it loses baggage is very hard to estimate, because this is all built around the very problematic political questions that were raised by Vulso's behaviour. Because Vulso obviously wants a triumph. He's had his victory. It wasn't the victory he anticipated. It wasn't over Antiochus, but nevertheless, the Romans don't like Gauls. They've got that folk memory of the sack of the city by Gauls in the 4th century BC. There's frequent war with the Cisalpine Gauls. This will continue for a long time. They're seen as an enemy. So if you go and find some Gauls in Asia Minor and duff them up, that's a good thing as far as most Romans are concerned. At least that's what Vulso is expecting, that these people are suitably barbarian, uncivilized, dangerous enemies that he has gone and humbled, he has gone and defeated and turned them into nice, friendly allies of Rome, and they'll be on good terms with Rome's allies in the area. And quite strikingly, actually, after this conflict, the Galatians generally are loyal allies to the Romans. Now, that's partly because their leaders see this as the Romans as a useful friend to use against other rivals in the region. But it is a striking thing. They will tend to be rather loyal, and it'll be a good recruiting area for the Roman army for a long, long time. But that's all to come in the future. Vulso has completed the negotiations with Antiochus III, so the war with the Seleucids has been concluded on the terms we looked at last time. So he's able to report that, but he can't get the main credit for that because he didn't do any of the fighting. But he did do the fighting against the Galatians, and that's his big victory. So once again, as we emphasized last time, the Romans don't stay in the area. There is no permanent military presence left by Rome in Asia Minor any more than there is in Greece at this stage. They fight the wars, they impose treaties, and they make the defeated person basically declare to the world, yes, we're not the equals of Rome, we've submitted to Rome, and that's it, we won't be a problem again, we are suitably humble, the Romans are better than us. But the Romans don't stay to govern, to alter the area in any other way. Beyond those terms of the treaty and their support for various allies, it doesn't really matter. The Romans are not permanently present, and their level of engagement diplomatically will be sporadic and will tend to come in the main when different groups within the area go to Rome and send embassies there and ask the Romans for something. So it isn't a permanent engagement in the region. Now, Vulso, when he finally makes it back to Rome, comes under immense criticism. He reckons he's deserved a triumph, he's won the victory, he's counted enough enemy dead to justify for this, he's got all this plunder, he wants to march through the city, dress up as Jupiter for the day, ride in the victor's chariot, dedicate his spoils, and show off this immense wealth that he's brought back. But there are plenty of people in the Senate who are not happy with what he's done. So, Vulso's accused of attempting to make Antiochus renew hostilities, and when he found no excuse for war there and the king's forces made no move, he'd led his army round to attack the Gallo-Grecians, one of the other names for the Galatians, although war had not been declared against that people by the authority of the Senate or by the sanction of the popular assembly. How much of this procedure was followed, Gnaeus Manlius, so as to enable us to regard this as a public act of war for the Roman people, and not a private act of brigandage of your own? So, there are plenty of people who, for whatever reason, and maybe some of them are being entirely honest when they say, well, this is not a just war. Rome emphasizes its faithfulness, its fides, its straight dealing with others. We stick to our alliances, we stick to our word. If we promise to be your friend, we will stay your friend and we will back you up and we will look after you. And if you're declared as an enemy, then we will treat you in the opposite way, and we will beat you until you cease to exist or you become our friend and our ally. So people could say, look, Vulso's gone out. He wasn't told by the Senate. There wasn't a popular vote. Remember, go back again to when we look at the Constitution. It's the people who formally declare war and also formally declare peace at the end of a war. So all those treaties we looked at with the Macedonian kingdom and with the Seleucids have to be ratified by a vote in the popular assembly. So Vulso hasn't done any of this. He's gone off, he's found his own war, he's made a war happen against the people that the Romans didn't want him to fight. He's defeated them and plundered them, and now he's expecting us to reward him for this, to pat him on the back and say, oh, well, you know, youthful high spirits, and hey, they're a load of foreigners, a load of barbarians, so what does it matter? You know, probably that a few of them are dead and some of them are enslaved and now they're our subordinate allies. Well, that's got to be a good thing, hasn't it? So even though we didn't want you to do it, fair enough, you're acting in the interests of the Republic. But plenty of voices don't say that, and Livy, who gives us the most detailed account, rather suggests that a majority were inclined to condemn Vulso. Now, at the very least, they could have forbidden him from celebrating a triumph, so he doesn't get that award, but also he might start then to be prosecuted, and perhaps this could mean the end of his political career. Now, as consul, he's probably reached the pinnacle of what's most likely, but he might hope for a censorship. Maybe if he's young enough, healthy enough, he might think in a decade's time of trying for the consulship again. He could certainly be a senior statesman, wield that auctoritas, that influence, that authority that we've talked about before in the Senate. Be one of the big men of the Roman Republic. Enjoy his prestige, enjoy his wealth that he's acquired for some considerable time. So that could weaken him, and it's potentially even he could end up being convicted of more serious crime and forced into exile. So that could happen, and Livy suggests that it came very, very close to that, but night fell. The accusations would have prevailed that day over the defence, had they not prolonged the argument till a late hour. When the Senate adjourned, the general feeling was that the triumph would be refused. Again, remember, the Roman Senate does not meet in the hours of darkness, and if a subject has not reached the point of being voted upon, then you start again the next day. You can't just carry over and say, right, first order of business is we will vote on that issue that we got to, or we will continue that debate. You have to start again. But the next day, the relations and friends of Gnaeus Manlius exerted all their powers, and the influence of the older senators was brought to bear. These senators pointed out that no precedent had come down in history for a commander to enter the city as a private individual without any mark of honour, denied the chariot and the laurel wreath when that commander had crushed the enemy, had successfully completed his term of command, and had brought home his army. Respect for precedent prevailed over personal dislike, and a full house of the Senate decreed a triumph. So what we've seen is a variety of opinions, and many of them hostile to perhaps to Vulso himself. There might be personal rivalries involved as well. They just don't like the bloke. But also there's an element where we're thinking, no, this man has done the wrong thing. This is not how a Roman magistrate should behave, and therefore he should not get credit for it, and maybe he should be punished for it. On the other hand, there's been a delay, and then you've seen the workings of Roman politics in the same way that a vote in Parliament today here in Britain or in Senate or Congress, you know, there's an awful lot that goes on behind the scenes as people are trying to arrange just how people are voting, calling in favours, trying to say, okay, you get this, so just vote this way for me. That sort of thing is obviously all there in Rome as well, with the added element that you have no formal parties and you have a class that tends to stick together because they're all senators and there are 300 or so of them and they pretty much all know each other. And the leading men in particular know each other, they intermarry, and they're friendly. Now, Vulso has come back. He is using all his connections. His family, by marriage, by blood, are going around, and anyone they can influence is being persuaded to say, look, you know, he's not such a bad chap after all, and these are a load of Gauls, you know, who cares about them? They're bound to be an enemy. At least we've humbled them. A threat has been removed. So basically they're saying the Gauls had it coming. Vulso's only done what any of the rest of us would have done. It's in Rome's interest, even if it's, you know, it's a little bit grubby in the way he went about it. But overall, let's see things practically. A potential enemy has been defeated, and that's got to be a good thing. And, you know, he did win. He did bring back all this plunder. So even though there's been criticism for losing a lot of the plunder, for not dealing properly with Philip on the way back and suffering ambushes and small-scale defeats, then, you know, still, on the whole, the story is of a great Roman victory, and we ought to reward that. He's also brought home an awful lot of money, which means he can buy some friends as well. So this delay, because again, very often as with the Senate only meets on certain days. There can be delay if you end the day of several days in between, where they go out, they negotiate, they talk around and spread some gold around, spread some favors, do some promises. Look, you know, I can help you out with this in the future. And it convinces people, and very quickly, once the mood of the Senate has changed and people sense they're looking around. On the first day's debate, there were probably plenty of people thinking, actually, looks as if Vulso's going down. You know, there's enough strong and influential voices against him. Probably better if I join them, because then I'll be on the winning side. Now people hold a finger up to the wind, sense that actually most of those influential people, lots of them, enough of them to gather momentum, have decided that, okay, we're going to let him off, we're going to reward him, it's all fine. So therefore you want to be on that side. So it's, again, the way these debates work. But Vulso gets his triumph. It is, as with each successive triumph of people who win victories in the Eastern Mediterranean, it is more spectacular, more lavish than anything that's been seen before. Livy and others will condemn him for introducing excessive luxury into the city. The spoils were so splendid, so opulent, that it starts to corrupt the very moral nature of the Roman aristocracy and will lead towards all the bad things that will happen when eventually the Republic turns against itself, fights civil wars, and collapses. So Vulso is seen as a figure who plays a key role in that. And the whole war had this dodgy element. Now, it's a reminder that we should not expect the Romans to be simple in the way they think about overseas wars and expansion. Yes, there will be a lot of ideas that they hold in common, as there are with most societies, but we should expect a range of opinions. And this is something that we'll find expressed at every period when there's the information. When people look at the empire and its borders, there are voices saying, well, we should keep on expanding, let's go and conquer the entire world. There are others saying, no, we shouldn't do that. There are others that will question it altogether. You know, famously, you have Tacitus writing at the very end of the 1st century AD, makes a Caledonian chieftain say that the Romans created desolation and call it peace. That's quite a striking thing for a member of Rome's elite to say. And whether or not he believed it, the fact that he could express the idea, that he could imagine that certainly some of their enemies are going to think like that, but also that maybe they've got a point, again is a reminder. We can, as scholars, be far too simplistic when we look at these things and assume that everybody thinks exactly the same way in each society. And in most political environments, particularly such a competitive political environment as the Roman system, then there's going to be a range of voices. And these are human beings, and they are different in personality and the way they see the world, even if shaped by their society and its attitudes. So that's one thing to bear in mind, a note of caution. Don't try and make it too simple. Another thing, and a big problem, which it's very hard to avoid, that we'll try to a little bit as we go on, is that this scholarly debate is framed entirely as a question of Roman imperialism. So it's all about why the Romans conquered, or how they did it, which is Polybius's question. Not so much why does each war individually begin and what are other people doing out there. You can get the impression that the Romans are operating with entire freedom of action. They can do whatever they like to whoever they like when they want to do it, because they are bigger and they are stronger. And because we know that the Roman Empire will get so big and will last for so long, then you can easily come to the assumption that, oh, well, it was, you know, it's really up to the Romans. If they choose to conquer, they're bound to because they're so strong. That's a viewpoint from hindsight, and it's a very simplistic one. We need to remember that in every conflict there was at least one other side, and often several interested parties with agendas of their own. And the Romans don't have complete freedom of action, and they don't always win, and they don't have unlimited resources. So yes, we talk about Roman imperialism, but we also need to think about Macedonian imperialism, Macedonian foreign policy, the policy of each tribe, each individual leader, each kingdom, wherever the Romans go. So it's a good deal more complicated than a simple Roman thing. And the problem is, of course, that overwhelmingly our sources come from the Roman point of view. Something else worth noting before we go on to the various modern theories of why the Romans have expanded is to think back to that quote from Polybius we looked at right at the start. Polybius asks the question of how the Romans came to dominate the Mediterranean world, his world, the entire world as far as he was concerned, what their military system was, what their political system was. And Book 6 of Polybius' Universal History talks about this in great detail and is one of our best sources for the workings of the Roman Republic at this time, but also the workings of the Roman army. He doesn't ask the question why the Romans expanded, why they conquered. That doesn't seem to be an issue for him at all. And it's significant that he just assumes that because they were strong, because they had the ability to conquer, that they would do so. So he's thinking again in a way that reminds us that ancient attitudes are not necessarily our attitudes. As far as he's concerned, and this is probably broadly reflective of earlier Greek history, if you are strong, then you will dominate. If you're weak, you will be dominated. And it's basically a question of working out where in the pecking order of nations, of states you come, and trying to defend your reputation, your honor, your status, at least as far as you can to that degree, depending on what you've actually got to back this up. So again, all our modern questions, why are the Romans expanding? Why are they so aggressive? Why do they push out? Aren't ones that came immediately to Polybius's mind, and that's rather interesting. Now, as I said at the start, one of the ways that shows how society shapes our view of the past is the various ways that people have looked at the causes of Roman imperialism and explained Roman expansion. Now, we're going to go back rather further than we normally do in terms of talking about the scholarly consensus, the main trends in debate. Now, an awful lot of modern ancient history still relies very much on the pioneers in the 19th century who turned history into a more modern pseudo-scientific discipline, at least as they would understand it. Very many of them were German, and there is that tradition. There is always a tendency, if you ever think when you're looking at aspects of the Roman world or the Roman army or Roman politics that you've come up with a bright idea, and here's something that I should look at for just how many times do our ancient sources mention this on inscriptions in literary sources or whatever, and precisely how we might define that and what we might mean, then you'll often find that a Mommsen or a Delbruck or one of the many other eminent German scholars has got there before you and has already done this and has catalogued it with the full extent of evidence that was available at the time and done so entirely methodically. And you go back to, Tenny Frank and others and these British historians who again were very, very thorough with what they had available and were linguistically probably in many ways more sophisticated than we were, because that's the tradition, the educational system they'd grown up with. So there used to be a view that Rome's imperialism was actually a defensive policy. And this is a review reflected by people of that era, of the later 19th, early 20th centuries, of the Mommsens, of the Tenny Franks, of people like that. Again, scholars whose books do actually reward reading if you get the chance, but are less likely to be the immediate book you go to these days because they're not so readily available. And they do reflect the state of knowledge at the time, and archaeologically we know so much more. We have so much more data than they had available to them. So things have changed in that respect, though it hasn't necessarily shifted all of the weights of evidence and where it seems to be pointing. So this was the period, when you think back to what's going on in late 19th, early 20th century Europe, this is the epitome, the height of success for the European powers, the European empires. If you look at the Germans, well, you've had the whole process under Bismarck of German unification, of German expansion, of defining this new Germany and turning it into a world power as a single entity rather than as all the different states and the larger Prussia, but all the other princely states that existed up until then. It's also, more obviously, you look at any map and you will see the large parts of it that are pink because they were owned by the British, they're part of the British Empire, or they're French, or they're Dutch, or they're colonies of Spain or Portugal, or the smaller German colonies. The European empires dominated the globe at this time. And that shaped an attitude towards empires of the majority, though certainly it was never universal, to accept empires as normal and to think of them as essentially a good thing. in a way that is alien to us, but we live in a different world. So they tended to make very conscious assumptions between and associations that they were, in a sense, the successors to all that was best of the Roman Empire. And, it is no coincidence that various countries would choose an eagle as their symbol. That symbol of power, but it's also the Roman eagle, in the same way that Napoleon, when he was building his monuments, had that classical inspiration again and again gave eagles to his regiments. So the Romans were this dream, this distant memory of sophistication, of power, of success. And that doesn't mean they were blind to the cruelties that were involved in Roman society and the Roman Empire. It's just that there was much that was seen as good, as civilized, in contrast to the chaos of the Iron Age, or even worse, Dark Ages. What followed? When the Roman Empire fell, then the world seemed to get smaller, nastier, more brutish, more chaotic. And it took a very long time until you move through the Renaissance to the Enlightenment before we get close to what we've got today, which is obviously how we like to see the world. This is how the world should be. There is a tendency for almost every society to think that all that they see in the world around them and their status is normal and is therefore natural. And the more successful you are, the more likely you are to consider that that success is well-deserved and that's right and proper. Natural. The less successful, and you're perhaps thinking, well, things are bad, I need to set this right, I need to change things. But if you're doing rather well, there is a tendency to pat yourself on the head and say, yes, fine, I deserve this. Whether it's thinking of this as a country, as an empire, or as an individual, I am wealthy because I deserve to be wealthy, and I'll be a nice person, I'll do good things with it. But nevertheless, though, this is right and proper. I am responsible with this. So this assumption that empires are essentially a good thing pervades much of the scholarship of this era and will have quite a long legacy. So it's the triumph of the advanced, sophisticated Roman civilization over barbarians, over uncivilized tribes, aggressive, violent peoples. They faced a little bit of a problem when they came to Rome's expansion into the Greek East, because obviously there was an immense admiration for all that was best of Greek culture, for philosophy, for the art, the poetry, the drama, the comedy. That expression, as well as the sort of the ascension, this is a time when people are elevating Marathon to being one of the critical battles in world history. Defeating the Persians meant that Greek culture could flourish and turns into Western civilization, and aren't we great? It's again that logical sense that as far as we're concerned, this is part of our story. We can make some claim to this because even though we're in most cases ethnically descended from all the barbarians that the Romans conquered or eventually that brought down the Roman Empire, well, yes, but culturally we've taken on all that was best of Greece and Rome and added Christianity to that. So, that's created our wonderful, confident civilization that we have now. And they could extend that, because obviously that's how the empires are liking to think about themselves at the time, particularly at this stage, which in many cases, for instance, the British Empire, is when you've already taken most of the territory you control. That's already happened. Now you're saying, well, we deserve to have this and we will use it responsibly and we will civilize, we will spread modern ideas, we will spread Christianity, we will spread modern medicine, we will spread modern education, we will lift people up to our level rather than the poor benighted heathen they were before. All of this is there. There's this assumption that there is a good, beneficial, civilizing role that the authority of empires allows them to undertake, and that therefore inherently they're good things, therefore we can sleep soundly at night because we're good people, because we're part of this, and in our small way we're part of the British Empire or the French Empire or whatever it might be. We are making the world a better place. And there's a sense of, it's that very Victorian idea of progress, that people look at history in much the same way. And they'll come with, the constitutional historians in Britain in particular are looking back at British and in particular English history, and they're seeing the development and they're saying, well, okay, yes, the Norman conquest is pretty brutal, but actually this will lead to a situation where a century and a half later you get the Magna Carta. You get these foundations, you get the development of the idea of a parliament in the form it will take, that will lead towards the 17th century and beyond, and our modern constitutional monarchy, parliamentary democracy, which is the best system anybody could possibly have. And if you want proof of that, look at how big the British Empire is. You know, in a sense, it's almost like taking the Polybian idea that this is the system of government we have, and wow, look how successful we've been. But we're doing this responsibly. But it also is the story of British history that way, is a story of war and struggle. You know, the old way of talking about history was kings and queens and battles. And it was still pretty much taught like that to me, certainly in prep school in the earlier stages. And in many ways, all the better for it. It gives you a framework chronologically to know who's around, what's going on, and then you can fill in what these societies are like and other issues. So it's still one of the best starting places. And you neglect it to your peril because all the grand theories have to fit into that chronology and these big events. But there was a sense that we end up with Victorian England, Victorian Britain, the British Empire, through many, many centuries of struggle. There is much that is unpleasant, there is much that is cruel. There have been bad kings, there have been civil wars. There's been the Wars of the Roses, there's been the civil wars of the 17th century, there have been the Jacobite risings. There has been cruelty. There has been struggle, there has been conflict, but that struggle and conflict has led to the wonderful thing that we are today, and maybe the future will be even better. But this is still that very optimistic period before the First World War has shattered so many illusions. And you can see this idea reflected not just in how people understand history, but in other things. If you look at Darwin and the theory of evolution, regardless of the science, this is a very Victorian idea. This sense of progress, of things developing to become more sophisticated, more efficient, more successful, of the survival of the fittest. Yes, there's struggle, but you end up with birds, animals, creatures, human beings that are far more sophisticated than the ones that have come before and able to do all sorts of things. So again, there's a sense of, yes, there's all sorts of unpleasantness and violence that happens to get there, but what you end up with is really great. And it fits in with this sense of Victorian England, Victorian Britain as the epitome of all that's best about the world, about the human experience. And yeah, the people, you know, the French, the Dutch, the Germans and others, they're quite good, they're trying their best, they're just not quite us. And of course, in those countries, they see things the other way around, put themselves at the centre of it all. So they extend this idea of progress, of development to the Romans. And of course, they have very neatly here the Pax Romana. They can see the monuments, and of course archaeology is developing to expose more of them, of the flourishing culture of the Roman Empire. They can see the roads, the circuses, the temples, these grand monuments that are still spectacular, you know, in some cases 2,000 years later, or 1800, you know, depending on when the monument was built. Incredible, spectacular, vast achievements, vast organisation. You know, there's a direct comparison. You can see that statue of Boadicea in her chariot outside, just across the road from the Houses of Parliament in London, that has Regent Caesar never knew, to emphasise that Queen Victoria, the Queen of the day, another strong woman who's doing all these things, has not only won, which of course Boadicea didn't, but has gone off and expanded to create an empire that's vastly bigger than the Roman Empire ever was, that covers a quarter of the entire globe. And by this time we know just how big the globe is, which the Romans didn't. At least they didn't know about all the continents, the Americas and all that sort of thing, Australia and the like. So there's this direct comparison that you get struggle, you get violence, but in the end you get something that is really good and is for the wider good of all people, because more people are better off in this culturally sophisticated, prosperous, peaceful world that the Pax Romana creates than had been before. And that would be, again, when the Pax Romana crumbles and falls, again, comes back to the Dark Ages, things are going to get really bad afterwards. So it allows you to think of your own empires as a good thing and the Romans by extension and by reflection as a good thing. If you think empires are good, that tends to influence how you see the process of imperialism, how empires are created. Because if you see them as ultimately ending in something that's rather good, that's beneficial to the world, it's a little bit uncomfortable to conclude that they are created by people who are greedy, who are violent, who are aggressive, and who go out there to slaughter and to plunder others simply because they can. So you do find that, particularly in the case of the British Empire, this sort of belief that somehow it's almost happened accidentally, that, it's been acquired in a fit of absence of mind, that you haven't systematically gone out and said, let's make a quarter of the globe British. You've instead got involved in one incident after another that has somehow led you where you feel in the end, yes, you've got to conquer these people because they're a danger, or you have to conquer them because that way you can set things right. They're not able to govern themselves. They're simply not up to it. So therefore you've got to take charge. Again, it's a comforting thought if you are part of one of these great empires. So it's not just about glory. It's not just about money. There has to be a sense of, haphazard nature of all this. It's just happened. You've ended up conquering and acquiring all of this just because you are actually decent people who try and do the right thing, and you're strong and you're efficient and you're brave and you're good at all of these things. Not necessarily because, we can manufacture more weapons than anybody else and we know how to use them, therefore this is how we conquer other people. But this is the context that people are thinking, that they have in the back of their mind when they come to look at the Romans. So again, there was a trend for a long time not to see the Romans as conscious imperialists. So that, again, it's rather like modern empires, it's just so many wars happen, and the wars are often not the Romans' fault, but they resolve them by conquest, by occupation, and then they create the Pax Romana, and isn't that wonderful? So this was defensive imperialism, as this sort of almost paradoxical expression, where the Romans fight to protect themselves and protect their interests and protect their allies. Now, this was very much the Roman point of view. The Romans liked to maintain that their wars were just, and the chief justification war was to protect yourself, your interests, or your allies, which meant that you really wanted to see the enemy as the aggressor. The enemy had done something to you that deserved punishment. And of course, you have the Fetial law that will be revived by Augustus, perhaps even half created by Augustus in the 1st century BC, where the tradition that's preserved in Livy and elsewhere, that these priests would compile a list of grievances against the foreign group involved, present these demands to them and say, well, look, this is what you've done, and if you don't make recompense, then we're going to hit you with a very big stick. And that means that the war is just because you've given them a chance. So there is this perception that the Romans liked to feel that this was the case. Though, of course, we've mentioned earlier on, they form an alliance with Saguntum, a city that's hostile to Hannibal and threatened by him, that then gives them a reason to pick a fight with Carthage for the Second Punic War. We saw last time when we were looking at appeals from the Aetolians, from other groups within Greece, that are the pretext to go in to protect those allies, those friends, even if they're very new friends, against Philip V, against Antiochus III, whoever it might be at the time. So certainly the Romans use this interpretation, this excuse, this pretext, this explanation to justify much of their behavior, much of their warfare. So sometimes people were willing to admit they could see from the Roman sources, because it's even there in the sources themselves, they exaggerated the threat, or they responded rather more aggressively perhaps than was necessary, or even that they invented the threat altogether. And that wars could be caused by misunderstandings, by mutual incomprehension and mutual suspicion. But this idea that expansion wasn't planned. But also, again, it comes back to this idea. They didn't plan to do this, but what they create is rather good, and Roman civilization is better than anything else that will be on offer until you get into the 18th century and beyond, because it's more peaceful, it's more sophisticated, it's wealthier, and it could do all of these things. That's the view that tends to find favour with a lot of scholars. Now, there are exceptions, and obviously there's a Marxist interpretation from early on that does not see empires as a positive thing by any stretch of the imagination. Now, one thing that does seem to back up this defensive idea, or that was used at the time to justify it, is looking at the Roman pattern of creating provinces. Because again, we talked about it a little bit earlier this time, but last time when we were looking at the Macedonian Wars, the Syrian War. So the striking thing is that the Romans fight and defeat these powerful opponents and then don't occupy any new territory. They go home afterwards. So they defeat Philip V and they don't create a province in Macedonia or Greece. They defeat Antiochus and they don't create a province or a permanent presence in Asia. They defeat Perseus and they don't create a province in Macedonia. It's only later, after the Fourth Macedonian War, when things have gone badly wrong, they realise they've got to take charge. But there's a sense of the Romans as reluctant governors, reluctant imperialists in the sense of permanently taking over a region and running it. And that's, again, something that many of the empires like to see was a characteristic of themselves. They only do this because they have to, because if they don't, there will be anarchy, there will be chaos. So there is a dismissal as well as part of this of the idea that the Romans are out for a fast buck and the Romans are out to profit from their empire. Not that these scholars couldn't see that the Romans do, in due course, profit from their empire, and not that they ignored the fact that the triumphing generals come back with all their spoils, they come back with their slaves, and therefore there is a short-term profit to be made from victory. But the idea was that if you're not going and directly administering a place, then you're not raising taxes there, you're not raising a constant revenue. And the reluctance to create provinces suggests that's not really something you want or you're interested in. So, this reacts to the Marxist view, which tends to see everything in economic terms, that the empires are deliberately going out to exploit other populations directly or indirectly. So there is this view, and it's trying to present this, generally speaking, positive view of Roman empires because, because they have a positive view of modern empires. That's how the world, in its most advanced state, which is when these people are writing, as far as they're concerned, that's how the world works, and it is generally beneficial because it's not just good for the imperialists and they make money, but also it's this sense of their civilizing role. They're lifting people up, they're educating them, doing all of these things we mentioned earlier. So they say, well, actually, Rome as a state doesn't systematically benefit from expansion. Individuals do, but it's not this constant source of revenue from all these provinces that the Roman Republic administers, and that will happen eventually, but it isn't at this stage, so it can't explain what they're doing in the 2nd century BC. Now, this view had quite a long life, really, as an academic argument, even when it became increasingly challenged after the First War, but then more particularly after the Second World War, and then in the years when the Western empires, the European empires, would be swept away. So it did rather last. It's there in comparatively recent books written in the second half of the 20th century. People like Errington, Badian, they've emphasized very much this reluctance to annex of the Senate in 2nd century BC, and for quite a long time. There are accumulations of new provinces, but more often than not, the Romans prefer to run a region through allies whenever they can. They also say, well, they're not doing that. The Romans don't want to take on the responsibility of running other people's affairs. And this will be something when we come to look at provincial government, we'll actually see does reflect the reality. And the Romans don't have this great bureaucracy they can send out to administer cities and tribes and large regions. They're doing it all on a shoestring, and as far as possible they get the locals to administer themselves and just put the Roman governor and his staff at a level above them for arbitration and to make sure they're not doing anything that the Romans really don't want them to do. So there's an element of practicality. The Roman state doesn't have the capacity to go off and administer large swathes of the globe. However, you could argue that, well, if they're really interested in imperialism and exploiting and, conquering territory so they can exploit it directly, wouldn't they develop this administrative system? Because surely that would be in their interest. They don't, so at least not in this era. So there's an emphasis on hegemony, on having lots of subordinate allies out there who run their own affairs, who will even keep the peace in the area or will dominate the area so that there aren't wars that are making it unstable. They're friendly towards your merchants, to your people, your ambassadors when they come out. They come to you with their big problems. They keep on telling you how great you are. They ask for your arbitration. They keep on asking you for help, but most of the time you don't give it. And you let them get on with their own affairs. So it shows a sort of reluctance to engage, other than at a very distant sense, that again fits with the idea that, well, the Romans aren't really interested in conquest as such. They like to feel powerful. They like to feel that they can defeat any threat that might appear, that they are dominant, but they don't actually want to go out and govern an empire. Not in the territorial sense, not of occupying these provinces and administering them. They also, though, this is a trend that develops more. It's already been there in some of the earlier works, but it develops more in the sort of post-1945 era, that tends to see Rome's behaviour as very different in the Eastern Mediterranean to the West. And essentially the division will be between civilized states that are overwhelmingly Greek or Hellenic to some degree or another, and the tribal peoples of Gaul, of Spain, of North Africa, and elsewhere as the Romans expand, who are politically disunited, more aggressive, more warlike, barbarians, pure and simple, as the Greeks and Romans would have put it, and that you need to wield a bigger stick when you're dealing with them because these people aren't so impressed with diplomacy. So you can be more subtle in your dealings with the Greek states because you can negotiate with them. They'll have a written peace treaty that they'll understand, and they're just easier. You find that you can relate to them in a way that you can't to the savage peoples of the West. Now that's a gross distortion of the reality of those various societies that vary far, far more than that. And in particular in the Iberian Peninsula you have some very sophisticated organized societies, especially in the southern and central areas, that do compare reasonably well to Greek city-states that you could deal with in the same way. So there was this idea that there was a distinction. When you went to deal with the Greeks, you were a lot more polite, you were a lot more courteous, but you could also expect them to respond in the same way. You could deal with them, you could proclaim the freedom of the Greeks, you could expect them to be able to cope with their own affairs, and also they would complain about you. So if you behaved badly, the Greeks could send an embassy to Rome with some fluent speakers who would tell you that, the consul so-and-so or the praetor so-and-so has gone out and has started a war for no reason, done what Manlius Vulso has done, basically. You will be able to complain about them. And in the heartland of Greece itself, then that would be even easier. It's more likely you will get complaints. Whereas somebody turns up from a tribe in Gaul, nobody can pronounce his name, nobody can pronounce the name of his tribe, they don't know where it is. They're less able to access the political machinery of the Republic and make a complaint. And therefore there's a lot more freedom to Roman governors. Not just do they see these people as more inferior, as barbarians, as savages, so they see them as dangerous as well, but they also think, well, I can get away with more here than I can there. So there's also the sense that if you go and attack Athens, people will hear about it and they'll know about it. You go and burn down an oppidum in Spain, nobody knows where it is, nobody cares. Back in Rome. So there's a sense that there is a distinction, and they tend to emphasize, so they're willing to see the Romans in the West as far more aggressive than the Romans when they're dealing with the Hellenistic East. And here they talk about triumph hunting and the idea that Roman governors are going out simply looking for an excuse to fight a war, kill people, plunder them, go back with glory, with credit, hopefully get a triumph from it. In a way they can't. They simply don't have that freedom of action in the Greek East. So you get quotes like this: the record of Roman war and policy in Spain is one of cruelty and treachery almost unparalleled in Roman history. Yet not a single commander came to serious harm as a result. Not the perfidious mass murderer Sextus Sulpicius Galba, whom Cato tried to attack but who survived to be an honoured master of Roman oratory. There are certain differences, and we'll look in much more detail next time about Roman expansion and conflict in the western part of the Mediterranean. So we'll look at this in more detail, but it's worth just mentioning a few things. There is a sense from our sources that things are different in many of these cultures. So for instance, here's an incident from 152 BC in Spain, where the Nergabriges, hearing of his moderation, sent and asked what they could do to obtain peace. This is the Roman commander of the time. In reply, he ordered them to furnish him 100 horsemen and auxiliaries, and they promised to do so. But in the meantime, in another quarter, they were attacking the rear guard of the Romans, carrying off some of the baggage animals. They came with the 100 horsemen and claimed to fulfill their contract, explaining the attack on the rear guard as an error committed by certain of their people who were ignorant of the agreement. Marcellus then put the 100 horsemen in chains, sold their horses, devastated their country, distributed the plunder to his soldiers, and besieged the city. So you have cases where, this is probably a cultural misunderstanding as much as anything. It was harder for the Romans and in the Greeks before them to understand that many societies in other areas had a very loose political structure. And many of these warrior cultures were fiercely individualistic, so that if one chieftain decides to do something, it doesn't mean that all his neighbours are doing the same. And if one individual warrior decides to do something, he's not responsible for somebody else who decides to do the opposite. So the probability is here that the Nogabriges had negotiated in faith as far as they were concerned. It's just that part of the tribe, they didn't know what was going on, but also didn't really care, and is just doing what they feel it is their right to do as free members of the tribe, and go off and plunder the Romans because they could. It's going back to the attack at Tabai we dealt with right at the start. The Romans look vulnerable, they have something we want, let's go and take it because we're strong, we're brave, and that's what strong and brave warriors do. But it could be confusing because the Romans probably would see this as treachery when it wasn't really that. It's just a reflection of a much less centralized and centrally controlled society. But we do hear clearly where there are not just mistakes, but deliberate misbehavior. So again, 151 BC, Lucullus, being greedy of fame and needing money because he was in straitened circumstances, invaded the territory of the Vaci, another Celtiberian tribe, although he had no warrant from the Senate, nor had they ever attacked the Romans or offended Lucullus himself. And, the city surrenders to him, and then he massacres them and plunders them. So it's a particularly nasty incident. So you do get, when people talk about this brutality and cruelty of Roman expansion, there are plenty of incidences that even these scholars could see and were trying their best to understand. So it became this idea that, well, you could do this sort of stuff in the West that you couldn't do in the civilized East because you just couldn't get away with it there. But it does show a Roman commander starting a war for his own personal benefit. He wants money, so he finds somebody to fight and murders them. It didn't always go well. Sometimes these people who go and provoke fights end up actually losing. But nevertheless, it's part of this ambition, this desire to do, and the freedom. While a Roman governor is in his province, there's nobody looking over his shoulder telling him, well, you can't do that, you can't do that. He might get prosecuted back in Rome, he might get denied a triumph back in Rome, but essentially he is master of what he does, and for the duration of his command, which might be a short period. We've already looked at Manlius Vulso arriving too late for the war, so making one of his own. We could think back to Flamininus, as we mentioned, negotiating with Philip until he finds out that he isn't going to be replaced by one of the consuls of the new year, and therefore breaks off negotiations, fights the war to a conclusion, wins the Battle of Cynocephalae. So you get these situations where people are acting not for the good of Rome, for the good of the Republic. They are thinking very personally as Roman aristocrats, what will benefit me? What will I want? So let's come back to the Third Macedonian War, when, again, one consul is sent to fight Perseus, but his colleague is not. And this is a chap called Gaius Cassius. Second consul failed to achieve anything of note in Gaul, that's his Alpine Gaul, which had fallen to his lot, and made a vain attempt to lead his legions through Illyricum to Macedonia. The consul's venture on this journey became known to the Senate through an embassy from Aquileia, which complained that their colony was new and weak and had as yet been insufficiently fortified against the surrounding hostile tribes of Histrians and Illyrians. On their requesting that the Senate should concern itself with the means for fortifying of the colony, they were asked if they wished the matter to be entrusted to Gaius Cassius the consul, but replied that Cassius, having mustered his army at Aquileia, had set out through Illyricum to Macedonia. This report seemed unbelievable at first, and the senators each thought to himself that a campaign against the Carnians or Histrians had been begun. Then the envoys from Aquileia said that they knew and dared assert nothing more than that 30 days' grain had been issued to the soldiery, and that guides who knew the roads from Italy to Macedonia had been sought out and taken along. Then indeed the Senate was incensed that the consul had such effrontery as to leave his own province, trespass upon his colleagues, lead his army by a dangerous, untried route among foreign peoples, and leave open to so many tribes the way into Italy. A full Senate decreed that the praetor Gaius Sulpicius should name 3 envoys from among the senators, who should that very day set out from the city and with all possible speed overtake the consul Cassius, wherever he might be. They were to declare to him that he must not engage in war with any people unless the Senate had determined on war against them. So here you have a remarkable incident where a man is allocated to Cisalpine Gaul and not Macedonia, but says, well, blow that for a game of soldiers, musters his army, gathers as much food as he can, a month's worth, and sets out to march overland to Macedonia to get in on the action, to try and find and defeat Perseus himself. So it's the only reason the Senate find out about this is because the colony at Aquileia is a bit worried about its defences, and they've gone to ask the Senate for help. Look, we're under threat. And they said, well, you've got a consul with a consular army there. Can't he help? Well, he's actually gone. But again, it's chance that the Senate know about this, although perhaps the citizens of Aquileia or some of them were thinking, well, we need to drop a hint about this. We just can't go directly and complain about the behaviour of the consul. But this is someone who is saying, heck to what the state wants, heck to what I've been told to do. I am going off. This is the most glorious war around at the moment. I'm going to fight it. I'm going to win it. I want the credit. Now, it doesn't work in this case. He gets recalled, and it's black mark on his reputation. Nevertheless, that he thought he could do this suggests that at least some individuals are willing to bend the rules to a quite extraordinary degree. So this leads us to the trend that really developed in the 1970s and 80s, when you had scholars, often sometimes British scholars working in America like Harris, or at Cambridge like Hopkins, who looked at Roman imperialism and were coming very much from the viewpoint of a different generation. By this time, European empires had gone. They'd been swept away by the winds of change very, very rapidly. And when any of the European powers had tried to delay this, tried to cling on to things, generally speaking, it led to a nasty, brutal, and ultimately unsuccessful war. Most strikingly, of course, the French struggle in Indochina had led to American intervention in Vietnam. And you are dealing with very much that post-Vietnam era hostility to all war, hostility to civilized nations in inverted commas going off and fighting in other parts of the world, less sophisticated, less wealthy nations, the idea that this would brutalize them, that they behaved appallingly. This is the background of concern about what was going on, the anti-war campaigning and the odd extremes that went to, that was unusual. It was fairly new. In most countries up until that point, you hadn't had that level of protest against what your country was doing, and particularly against the people who were doing it, who often hadn't had a great deal of choice in all of this. But it's the time when, the My Lai massacre, all of these things, these are being exposed. It's film of napalm, of dead or burned civilians, this sort of thing, executions. That is all coming through, and it is heavily influencing the fashionable thought which tends to be reflected among academics. And college campuses in the States have been a big centre for a lot of the anti-war movement. So again, for lots of professors, this was the environment. This was what they accepted as normal. That was their viewpoint on all this. And they were coming back to look at the Romans and think, well, if this sort of thing is so bad in our era, how can it have been any better in the Roman era? It's one of those striking things. I grew up watching TV in the sort of middle to late 70s and into the 80s, dominated by, here in Britain, we got lots of cop shows from America, Starsky and Hutch and Columbo, and all these sorts of things coming through. There was a striking theme in that era that a very high proportion of the criminals were brutalized Vietnam veterans who came back and just turned to drug running and crime and murder and all this sort of thing. It was always the standard villain for a very long time, to quite a disturbing degree, until movie and TV trends in the 80s started to reassess things and allow people actually to be, in some cases, victims rather than the victimizer, but also, tried to present it in other ways. But this is very much this post-Vietnam War sense that adventures overseas are always bad, always make you brutal, always lead to dreadful consequences, and therefore the extension of all of this, that again comes with that general, for want of a better term, sort of left-leaning political environment within most universities in the West, meant that people didn't have the same attitude to empires that had been the case among most scholars a couple of generations before. The world had changed dramatically, and there was that weird sense, even among those who didn't have a particularly hostile view to British history, the British Empire, all of these sorts of things, to the degree that it would develop for others, would look back at this, there was this sort of weird sense of, oh, well, yes, we used to have an empire, but, we didn't really want it anyway, we're glad to get rid of it, all this sort of thing, and, we're just a bit embarrassed about it. It is very striking that in recent years and decades, when you had, Britain as part of the American NATO-led intervention, Afghanistan and Iraq, there were almost no documentaries on television and very few books written looking at the history of earlier British interventions in those regions, which you would have thought was an obvious thing you'd want to try and understand and know about if you're going to understand the modern world. But it's simply just something, it's almost been, a large part of society has just pretended that didn't happen. And the ones who want to bring it up are generally the ones who want to be very, very critical. And that's obviously a valid point of view, but it isn't the only point of view. You need to be, if you're going to understand history, judging it and emphasizing this is bad, these people are terrible, is not the historian's job. The historian's job is to understand. Because frankly, if your audience can't understand that massacring people or enslaving people are bad things by their very nature, then just repeating that this is a bad thing probably isn't going to convince them. The facts should speak to themselves. We are here to try and explain why things developed that way, how the world worked, and not just go around making ourselves feel better by saying, well, I'm not like that, I didn't do all of these things, and therefore, because I keep saying these people were terrible, these people were awful, that makes me a better person. We need to understand. That is the historian's job, understanding, trying to piece it together. And there is great value in many of the voices that were raised in this reaction to the old defensive imperialism, which, by its very nature, the idea that in defending yourself you end up master of most of the known world is inherently problematic. It doesn't really make much sense. There's got to be a willingness to expand at some point, even if it isn't the sole driving force. So the emphasis came from the 70s and 80s very much on the driving forces behind Roman imperialism. And the assumption was empires are inherently wrong, inherently bad things. Now, there's been a reaction with that as well that often means, well, they're bound to be inefficient as well, which doesn't necessarily follow the logic. Just because you don't like something doesn't mean it can't have been effective at doing what it was doing, whether that was a good thing or not. So there is an emphasis, and you can see this percolating through, particularly Harris's seminal War and Imperialism in Middle Republican Rome, and Hopkins' Conquerors and Slaves, where for most liberal academic circles, empires are automatically a bad thing. They're the oppression of the weak and the oppression of undeveloped countries by the rich, by the strong industrialized nations. They're only to exploit the subject population to make money, and they cause great human losses and destroy ancient cultures. So again, you could see one of these if you look at the attitude towards missionaries. In the Victorian era, they were very often praised, though there were sometimes significant political voices saying it's really just rude and politically crazy to go to an area and tell people all your beliefs are wrong, you need to believe what I believe, because why should they like you for it? But missionaries then steadily became villains of the peace because they go out and they destroy these ancient religions because they convert everybody to Christianity. So we can't go back to that culture in this area and discover what they had been like for generation after generation. It's just, again, it's a question of what assumptions you're coming with, you're bringing along when you look at the evidence. So, if empires are a bad thing, it's natural to assume that the motives behind their creation are squalid, are sordid, are unpleasant. So this is the emphasis on empires out for their own gain, imperialism as planned, as orchestrated, or as something that is just so pervasive within your society that this is how you behave. You are more brutal, more aggressive than everybody else. That's why you become the biggest bully. And any attempt to justify it as anything other than that is simply self-serving hypocrisy. So the idea that the Romans would have made anything better is just a nonsense. The idea that the European empires had done anything that was good is clearly a nonsense. Empires are bad, therefore everything they do must be bad, therefore the reasons behind creating them must also be bad and unpleasant. It's the flip of the coin to the old view of empires are good, therefore empires and imperialists are nice and they do lots of good things for lots of people. You just flip to the other extreme. Human history is rarely as neat and as simple as that. But it was a very important corrective to these rather benevolent views of the Roman Empire that was still very, very strong for a long time. So, now, the scholars who produced this work were generally very good scholars, so you can't just, they weren't people who were going and saying, oh, the Romans, they're just exactly like the Victorian British or the Spanish in the 16th, 17th century, and therefore they do things in exactly the same way. They did try to understand Roman imperialism as a phenomenon of the Roman and the ancient world. So basically, two of the sort of biggest and most influential views were these. Harris in his War on Imperialism is essentially argues that Rome as a society, as a political culture, was programmed towards expansion. The main factor, the biggest driving force in this, was the quest of the aristocracy for glory, for profit. And we've seen this when we looked early on at the political system, this celebration of past victories, of triumphs, this enumeration of the scale of your success. All of this is very important and very useful politically for the Roman elite. And they do compete with each other, and they do compete to get elected to office again with the next generation or to get higher office themselves. So that competitiveness that is there and that was fundamental to the system that we've already seen is based around enthusiasm for expansion, because the best way to get ahead in Rome was to go off and conquer somebody abroad, go and defeat the enemies of the Republic. So the aristocracy gain glory, but they also gain wealth, which allows them to advertise their glory, to make more friends, to buy more friends, just as Manlius Vulso had done when we looked earlier on, when he goes back and uses his influence and his money to persuade people not just to let him off, but to give him the triumph he wants and allow him to have this glory and to become a respected, prominent member of the elite. So although it's a very personal thing. Now, there is this general feeling that all of this expansion, all of this military success is good for the res publica, is good for Rome. The stronger Rome is, then the less Rome has to fear. Rome will be wealthier, but Rome will also be feared, and therefore enemies will not attack her, and we don't have to go and we can choose our wars rather than have them thrust upon us. But the military triumph is the highest aim of the aristocracy, and it's also, again, he emphasizes this again and again, people associate war with profit, war with gain. Not primarily with danger, but with, we're going to win, we're likely to win, and we'll come back rich. We get this glory, but we also come back very well off. And that extends down. It's particularly pronounced amongst the aristocracy, but even ordinary soldiers think, well, yeah, it's worth going off to go and fight the Seleucids because they've got loads of cash, so when we win, we'll come back with lots of money. Though remember again, think back when we were looking at the quotes on triumphs, how Aemilius Paulus was criticised for not being sufficiently generous to his army in the aftermath of the Third Macedonian War. So again, with all of these things, there are complicated elements. He also sees this very high participation of Roman citizens within the army as a sign of the militarization of Roman society, to the degree that they willingly came forward generation after generation to subject themselves to the tough discipline of the legions and to lose many of the rights they had as citizens in civilian life and go off and fight and risk their lives, but because they thought it was a good thing, but also they were willing to do this. And they were savage in the way they went about this. There are passages where Livy talks about the Macedonians being shocked after a skirmish between cavalry and light troops where they see the wounds inflicted by the gladius hispaniensis, the Spanish sword. And very interestingly, he singles out slashing wounds, heads cut off, limbs severed. Now, we know that most of the swords being used in this period are rather longer than the late Republican Principate gladius that's less than 2 foot. These are more 2.5 feet. They're more a balanced slashing and thrusting sword. But it's interesting, he quotes Polybius, where Polybius described in the context of New Carthage, when it was sacked by Scipio Africanus in 210 BC, of how when the Romans break into a city, they don't start plundering, they keep discipline, and they slaughter everyone and everything they meet. So he talks about even dogs being cut in two. So the Romans are savage, the Romans are brutal, and there's clearly a sense within this that because they go off and serve in the army, just as all those people drafted to go off in Vietnam had done, there's almost a sort of echo of that view that they are brutalized, they become vicious, and these nice kids that at home seemed harmless suddenly go off and commit all sorts of atrocities. You can see that there. It's not quite explicit, but it's clearly an underlying theme. It's, what do you expect? If you send people off into the army like that, that's how they're going to behave. And they're going to be brutal and they're going to be vicious. And he talks about how it's almost a biological need within the Roman system to every year go out and do massive violence against somebody. So he emphasizes the Romans as different. They are more aggressive, they are more violent in the way they go about this, and that this is a natural part of this expansion that follows. So that they only refuse to annex. He said, well, that's not really an argument against imperialism and the Romans saying that the Romans are aggressive, is that, well, they don't want to annex because they can't be bothered to do it. They only annex when it's in their interest. So that's not because they're nice people or because they're not interested in expansion. It's just that they're only interested in what's beneficial for them. And that otherwise they don't really care too much what happens in the areas where they've gone in and devastated someone and overthrown things. So that there still are powers in that area because they create subordinate allies and they expect those subordinate allies to handle things, and if they don't, the Romans will go back and might deal with them at some point. So he argues this whole idea of reluctance to annex doesn't really tell us anything about Romans' attitudes. They are still very aggressive, they still want to conquer. It's just that conquest doesn't necessarily mean physical occupation, it can mean domination. And that's something the Romans are very good at, and that's something they're doing. He will, in his second half of the book, tries to look at all the conflicts of this period and argue that you can interpret the sources to show just about all of them are provoked by the Romans, that other people out there aren't starting these wars. That's just an excuse. The Romans go out, they want glory, they want plunder, and they just go off and keep fighting people, and they're very vicious about the way they do it. So that's the view he presents. Hopkins came with a different attitude that was more of a sort of economic model for it, when he talks about this as something of a vicious circle, really, because the Romans are mobilizing large parts of their adult male citizen population and their Latin allied population as well, and send them off to different parts of the Mediterranean world to fight people. They're away for long periods of time, and they're winning lots of wars. As a consequence of winning those wars, very large numbers of slaves are captured and come onto the market and can be imported to Italy to provide a labour force. So at the same time as you have this influx and greater availability of cheap slaves, you also have some people at the top of society making immense profits out of successful war making. Now, these are the senior commanders who get the lion's share of the plunder, and the sale of slaves and all that would entail. But there are also the businesses and their leaders, who are often equestrians, who are taking on the state contracts to supply the armies in the field, who are taking on the contracts to sell all these slaves and taking commission on that. So there are lots of opportunities for a relatively limited number of people to make very large profits and become fabulously wealthy on a scale that has been unknown before in Roman society. So you've got this unfortunate combination where a lot of citizens are away, which means that they can't run and maintain their farms in the way that they have been able to in the past, when a campaign meant you were a few months away in the summer, but then you could come back, or a few weeks. When you go off to Spain for 10 years, then there is a fair chance that things won't be great back home when you arrive, that your family may not have been able to cope. And there are problems of debt, and there are also lots of people, lots of big investors, knowing that buying up large estates, buying up land and combining it to large estates is a very secure investment, because your profit might not be huge, but it'd be steady and long-term and permanent. And that instead of having lots of little farmers who will go off like the old hoplite farmers of the Greek world and go off and fight the wars the Republic needs, buy up a lot of that land, combine it into a big estate, bring in a slave labour force to work it that again can't be drafted off to go and fight wars, so is under your control, and you start to farm commercially on a scale that the smaller farmers can't match. And it's a vicious circle, because as more wars are fought, more men go off, their farms fall into ruin, they're bought up, the big estates get even larger, that dominates the market even more, and the smaller farmers are priced out. This is an issue that the Romans will feel is a serious one by the end of the 2nd century BC, and it's something we'll talk about in due course when we come to look at the Gracchi. And so clearly the Romans are worried about this. It's going on. So it's a sense that imperialism is almost feeding off itself. You need to have more wars because you need more slaves. And as you get more slaves and more profit, you buy up bigger estates, which in turn means you need more wars to keep those in, and so on, while at the same time you're depleting your military manpower of the citizen farmers on a relatively modest scale who have provided the backbone of the legions for centuries. They are under threat, are declining in numbers, therefore it means it's harder to fight your wars. So that will be an issue that will come on. So again, this is bringing out aspects. All these scholars who criticize the old view were very much using the sources and saying, well, look, this is things the Romans are saying and our sources are telling us. We just need to understand the role of this and give it due importance. There are modified views, people like Richardson, North, that sort of thing, that argue that Harris is basically right. There is an almost universal rejection of the idea of defensive imperialism that, as I say, doesn't really happen until the sort of 80s and 90s in the 20th century. It's quite slow. There's almost a delay from the demise of the European empires, the 20th century, before scholars catch up and start to adapt to a different world and then project that back onto the Roman world, just as previous scholars have projected their own view back onto the Roman world. So Richardson, who wrote this very important book, Studying Roman Imperialism in Spain, did argue that the Romans weren't actually systematic. There's not a sort of methodical sense of, right, we're going to take this bit, then that bit, we're going to dominate this community, that community. He sees it as much more haphazard, but brutally aggressive. And he does emphasize the triumph hunting. As we've seen with Lucullus, for instance, somebody just provokes a war for their own benefit, even though the Senate's told them no. And the brutality of it. And it is one of those things that as the sources improve for what's going on in Spain, there are plenty of incidents of misbehaviour by the Romans. You've got Sulpicius Galba, who massacres the Lusitanians. We've come across him before, where he promises to settle them on land so they come in and surrender, divides them up into 3 groups, and then kills nearly everybody, although some manage to escape, and is prosecuted back in Rome for this, not for the massacre, but for the breach of faith. And Cato the Elder, who is, one of the sort of leading supporters of supposedly stern old Roman virtue, criticizes him, wants him to be prosecuted. Galba gets away with it because he's supposed to have brought his children into a public meeting, probably not the trial itself, perhaps a public meeting before the trial. The children are weeping and saying, what will happen to us if daddy's sent off into exile and we lose all our money? And the crowd is supposed to feel so sympathetic for him that everybody senses the mood has changed and they let him off. And he goes on to become one of the most successful orators of his generation of Roman history. On the basis, I suppose, if he could get himself off a charge when he was so obviously guilty, then he can get anybody off anything. But he does get away with it, although critically he's not given another provincial command, so they don't trust him that far. But again, it shows that this complication, there are people like Cato who can come along and say, actually, this is bad. This is not how we should be behaving. It's pragmatically bad because if nobody trusts us, then they won't negotiate with us, or they'll break any treaty because they'll expect us to do it, whereas we want them to expect us to keep faith so that they will keep faith. And also that, it's just a bad thing, an inherently bad thing. Cato is an interesting voice because although most of his history has been lost, he wrote a history of Rome where he didn't name anybody, with a few exceptions like himself and like Saurus, Hannibal's elephant. So it wasn't a celebration of individual aristocrats and their families who've done all these wonderful things. It was a celebration of the res publica, of the Roman people, of us all going out as a state and winning these wars. So there are different views, and just because people like Manlius Vulso get away with it, people like Sulpicius Galba get away with it, might suggest that the majority in the end will let these people off, but it also suggests that there are plenty of others who see this as a bad thing and that you can't guarantee getting away with absolutely anything. But nevertheless, it is pretty nasty. North's argument was to emphasize the role of the Italian allies in this process. Again, go back to where we started. As Rome has expanded, they've turned former enemies into subordinate allies of Latin status, of Italian status. Some will eventually get Roman citizenship. Now, the only treaty obligation that most of these communities have to Rome is to supply troops to the Roman army when the Roman army requests it of them. So they go out and, as we said before, at least 50% and often a higher proportion of any Roman army is composed of these allies, predominantly from the Latins and other Italian communities. So the argument is, from this point of view, that if the only way to remind these allies that they are your subordinate allies and they need to show due respect to Rome, is to recruit them and send them off to fight wars, which means that you need wars to fight. Therefore, this is also a driving force towards expansion, aggression, finding new conflicts, because you've got to keep everybody busy, and then also rewarding these allies because they get a share in the spoils as well. So it's another one of these sort of things that's saying that, well, essentially the system requires the Romans to go out and find wars to fight. And if there isn't a good, just cause for it, well, they've got to find something and make it happen, because Rome needs warfare. Otherwise, the Roman system doesn't work. Aristocrats can't compete. Aristocrats can't excel. The allies aren't loyal. You don't have the slaves to run the big estates that you're creating and that you've, this as a consequence of imperialism, have developed. So as always with trends in academia, you had this reaction that was a very important reaction because it did pour a lot of cold water over some of the rather naive views that had been largely unchallenged beforehand of this old, generally favourable view of the Roman Empire. And it reflected the trends in Western society of the generations of the latter part of the 20th century. You know, we don't like imperialism, we don't like nationalism, we don't like all of these things, we're not better than anybody else, our system isn't superior. Rejecting many of the assumptions that they were often lumped together as Victorian values, and it would be in all sorts of social aspects as well. The idea is that there's hypocrisy, there was humbug in these Victorian ideas, they were just out for themselves. So you emphasize all that, instead of emphasizing all that was good about them, as people at the time had tended to do, you emphasize all that was bad about them, and that's the bit you bring to prominence. And then you take those assumptions and you go back, you re-examine the Roman evidence, and you do find things that other people have missed or have not highlighted. And there was a lot of really valuable work. This really did make people think in a different way. But as is natural, normal, and healthy in the academic world, there then comes a reaction to the reaction. And there isn't ever likely to be a point where you reach it and everyone says, right, these were the Romans, this is what they did, this is how we understand them, that's all sorted out. Isn't it nice and simple? Because it is worthwhile, we have to be aware of the fact that our assumptions about the world will influence the questions we ask about the Romans. It is good that when, as those assumptions change, that we ask different questions, because we're more likely to get more useful and fuller answers. We're exploring more and more of that ancient lost past. So Harris's book received the unprecedented honour, distinction of 2 reviews in the Journal of Roman Studies, which particularly then, it tends to be a little bit more esoteric these days, though I probably shouldn't say that and I'll be offending people. But in those days, a lot of key debates were developed in the pages of academic journals like that. And they still are sometimes, but there are a lot more conference reports. It's quicker to publish these days than it used to be, at least in theory. So things develop in a slightly different way, and more can be made available online as well, rather quicker than it could with a very long debate. And there was an element of criticism, one of which by Sherwin-White, very distinguished Romanist, looked at Harris's view in particular and pointed out many of the weaknesses, because it's one of the big problems when you have this all-encompassing theory and you see it as very important and as fundamentally challenging all that's gone before, you tend to over-egg the pudding. You tend to overdo things and try and prove it in every single case and make this utterly supplant and reject the old idea and replace it with a new one that is right and answers all the questions. And even if you know as a good scholar, as Harris, Hopkins, these people were, that you're not actually going to do that, that's the tendency. You tend to try and force it too far. And he pointed out that it's not such a good book on the small detail. When you look at the catalogue of wars, it is very often straining the evidence considerably to try and show or suggest that all of them were caused by the Romans, that it's always the Romans picking a fight. And, plenty of wars are not the Romans' fault. And it comes back to this thing we mentioned earlier. The Romans aren't just able to go out and do whatever they want. There are lots of other people out there. And wars can be provoked by either side. And they can be a result of misunderstanding and confusion and mutual suspicion and fear. So the idea of the Romans being worried, feeling they were threatened, and therefore to defend themselves, fighting all these wars that leads to conquering an empire, yes, it doesn't really explain everything, because in the end there's that big problem of logic. It's just at what point is it no longer acceptable to defend yourself? Are you just becoming over aggressive and picking fights with anybody and seeing a challenge anywhere? But it doesn't mean that at times the Romans didn't feel afraid. And clearly, last time we looked at the Second Macedonian War, where the Comitia Centuriata initially voted not to go to war with Philip V. They were persuaded to do so by the argument that, look, we've only just beaten Hannibal, and Philip could be here, he could do a Hannibal, he could invade Italy, do what Hannibal's just done to us. Do we really want that again? Look, we know this man's an enemy, he's fought us before, he'd stabbed us in the back, we've got to deal with him now, and let's deal with him on our terms, on his land, rather than on his terms in our land. So there are cases where it's probably not the Romans who are to blame. And of course, it is a complex situation where as powers arrive and expand into an area, they interfere with existing rivalries, power struggles, conflicts that are already there, or they're seen as an opportunity for new people to gain power by making them allies. One war can lead to another. And it's very difficult to pin down precisely and say, well, this is the moment when this first war happened, but that led to all the others, therefore who is to blame? Are the Romans to blame because they decided to intervene in Sicily in just before the First Punic War, or the Carthaginians to blame for their response? One tend to think for Harris it would clearly be the Romans. They're just aggressive, they're just out for glory, they're picking a fight, and maybe they wanted to have a war with Carthage, or maybe not. Or they just thought the Carthaginians would back down. There are two sides, at least, in all these struggles, and often there are far more than that, because there are lots of individual local allies and groups that are involved, all with agendas of their own. It's a theme I come back to again and again in my work, more and more as we go on. You can't just see everybody else as a victim. Don't just see the empire as, the old, rather dated Victorian view as this benevolent force that went out to civilize the world, but also don't see it as this appalling predator who just goes out to exploit everybody. Because there are other predators in the world, and this is something developed by the realists and that school of thought that's saying, well, it's all to do with the wider balance, that the time is right for the Romans to expand because there's a weakness of other authority out there that will arbitrate in disputes in different ways. I won't go into that in great detail. I must confess, even though I have great sympathy with the conclusions they reach through these studies, I'm not a great fan of theory, because I think it goes back to being in Oxford in the late 80s, early 90s, when there was all sorts of postmodernism and other garbage of that sort being pressed upon us that clearly made no sense at all to anybody, certainly not to me. And I think to most people, this sense of everything being a story and, there's no real fact and you can't establish things. If you think that, you might as well not bother to do history, and certainly not have the cheek to draw a salary that's requiring you to do this, because you're basically saying that nothing's true and nothing matters, so what the heck, let's just make up stories we like. So that has rather prejudiced me against all theory. The danger I see with theory is that it too often replaces actual thought about the evidence, because you've already got the answer before you look at it. And that's a very dangerous thing. Whatever that answer might be, it's going to distort your view and your understanding of the source material, and that's where you need to start. So this developed. The other thing Sherwin-White emphasizes is that actually, Rome isn't always the strongest person around. Rome doesn't have inexhaustible supplies of manpower. Yes, its reserves of manpower allowed it to defeat the Carthaginians as it had to defeat Pyrrhus, but it takes a huge hit in the process. And there is strain on that manpower, and there aren't always enough Romans to recruit. And of course, this will become a problem the Romans themselves get concerned about. Again, when we get to the Gracchi and others, we'll deal with this issue then, because there's all sorts of different views on that. They at least perceive there to be a shortage of suitable recruits for the army, of men to go and fight the next generation of wars. So there aren't always lots of legions. You can't always guarantee, and there are wars that occur in more than one place. That means that the state can't devote full resources to this, and they don't always take up a grudge in the short term or possibly at all, where there has been. There are cases where they decide to fight a war under sometimes comparatively flimsy pretext, sometimes under reasonable by ancient standards pretext, but there are other times when exactly the same or very similar conditions, they don't do either. And again, you come back to this reluctance to occupy territory, which in the main, once you do create a province, you end up with more and more wars on its borders because that's disrupted the balance of power in the region. So, in Spain, for instance, there's lots of conflict. When they do create the Macedonian province, there is frequent conflict there because you're bordering on tribes that the Macedonians have been fighting for generations. So the truth is much more complex, and people like Eckstein, Dyson, Callet Marx and others would emphasize the uniqueness of each frontier, so that you can't just do these blanket impositions. And there are clearly phases where the Romans seem to respond more aggressively for a few years, for a decade or more, and at other times where they clearly do not, and they are seeming to want to avoid war. It isn't as simple as that. There isn't the Harris idea of sort of biological necessity of going out and fighting aggressive wars of conquering. There's also a balance between the Senate and the man on the spot. Now, we tend to highlight the cases where the man on the spot goes cowboy and, starts to march from Cisalpine Gaul or try to get to Macedonia, or Manlius Vulso picks a fight with the Galatians in spite of no one asking him to, or similar things in Spain. Yes, those stand out, but there are lots more cases where the governor doesn't do that. And even in those cases, Cassius gets recalled from his march, his ambition to trog his way across and get to Macedonia. He gets pulled back. He gets recalled and told, naughty boy, don't do it again. Manlius Vulso only just gets away with it. Sulpicius Galba only just gets away with it. These people are criticised. It isn't as simple as that. And the governor does not have absolute freedom because he's got to think of his political future. So that's a balance between grabbing what he can get, but also making sure he can hold on to it, not doing anything too gross that he will be either disgraced altogether, or at least it will so severely diminish his reputation that he's not going to be influential when he gets home. And of course you have those things they can't control, the people who are trying to fight a war or want to conclude a war, but they can't win it quickly enough. So you have the negotiations. So it's all a balance, and it isn't simple, which doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of cases of individual aggression, of more general aggression, of bullishness on the part of governors, bullishness on the part of the Senate, and their willingness to commit resources to allow governors to go off and do this stuff. Because again, the resources a commander has come from the Senate. So, that's a level of control as well. And it's also the Senate's choice. Do they prorogue? Do they extend his command to make him proconsul, propraetor, or do they replace him with someone else? Which, is something that they all have to bear in mind. So the picture you have of the Roman aristocracy by Harris and to some extent Hopkins and others is too simplistic. It's one thing as well that's worth pointing out is that not all men, even when they reached high office, went out to a province and led an army. Some chose not to. And even some of those who go out and command a province and have an army at their disposal do not fight a war and do not appear to make any attempt to fight a war. So there's a good analysis of the Fasti Triumphalis, the lists of triumphing generals preserved in later inscriptions that are substantially complete for large parts of this period, though there are some bits missing, by John Rich in an article. And he came to the conclusion that actually there are fewer than 2 triumphs per year. That's the average. Now bear in mind, we don't just have the 2 consuls who are likely to be given armies to command, but by this period, several of the praetors will probably be given provincial commands and an army at their disposal, and have the opportunity to fight a war and win glory and win a triumph. There are a few praetors, and the intensity of expansion varies a lot. There's a lot more wars in the first half of the 2nd century BC than there are in the second. And only about 1 in 4 consuls actually celebrates a triumph. That's why it's such a valuable distinction. It does put you ahead above everybody else for the future and for your prestige. But that does mean that 3 out of 4 either are unable to find a war they can fight and then win it, or they don't try. And that's, that's a significant proportion are not getting this sort of credit. Between 200 and 167, there were 39 triumphs celebrated, but 12 of those were from praetors. So again, you've got these people coming in, and it does suggest the majority of Roman governors are not winning triumphs, and they're not fighting wars, or at least they're not fighting wars to a conclusion, wars on a scale that will allow them to triumph. Between 166 and 91, and there are some gaps in the evidence for this, there are only 46 triumphs. So the conclusion of these basic statistics is that triumph hunting is the exception rather than the rule, and that while some people go off and do provoke a war when one isn't already there, that most others do not, and most people don't, or they don't get away with it. And this comes back to this, the intensity of conflict does vary, and part of this is to do with the wider environment. And there are genuine threats out there. To see the Romans as simply victimizers rather than victims, there is this terrible modern tendency to divide the world into this simple sort of binary calculation. You're either the victim, which means you're essentially noble but you're weak, or you're the victimizer, which means you're inherently evil and you're strong and you're exploiting that. The Romans, for a start, are not the only predators out there. This is something the realists will emphasize. There are lots of other aggressive powers, and bear in mind, the Macedonians, the Seleucids, these were strong empires of their own. And they don't get to be like that and stay that way unless they go out and dominate by military force. And plenty of the tribal peoples do not see the Romans as we see them, as this power inevitably destined to conquer the world, and as immensely strong and as someone you couldn't fight. They see the Romans on the spot. They see a Praetorian army or a consular army, and they think, well, actually, we can get as many warriors as that, or if we ally with a few of the nearby tribes, we can get more than that. And we're brave people, we're strong warriors, why can't we beat them? And the Roman armies do sometimes lose. And, it isn't this inevitable Roman success. Roman wars are, in many cases, very hard fought. It's something, again, that if you go back and look at more recent imperial history, things aren't always as simple as that. This idea that, we have got the maximum gun and they have not, isn't always the decisive factor. And simply because we can see on a map that Rome controls a much bigger area, has a much bigger population than, say, the three Galatian tribes, doesn't mean that they don't think we can take on this Roman consular army and beat it. In their case, they are provoked, but nevertheless they are, and they're defending their own territory. But there are plenty of other cases where this idea that it's always an excuse when the Romans say that there was raiding on territory of their allies, and that therefore the Roman governor responded to fight the raiders or to punish them, stop them from doing it in the future, doesn't necessarily need to be a fabrication. And in fact, the pattern is so consistent that it does seem to be how the ancient world worked. Now, you've already got, for those of you who are willing to take on a fairly epic watch, my talk about raiding, and looking more perhaps at the later periods, but nevertheless it holds true all the way through. And there's a pattern again and again that if you are perceived to be weak, just like the population of Tabai thought the Romans were weak, right at the start in that quote from 189 BC, if people think you are vulnerable and you have something worth taking, there is quite a chance in the ancient world that someone will gather together in force and come and attack you, to take you captive, to plunder you, to kill you, for their glory, for their profit, for their plunder, because they can. And this feeling is, there is certainly in interstate relations between the Romans and most of their contemporaries, this sense that strength is what counts. If you have a reputation for strength, then people will be wary of you, they won't push you too far, they'll treat you with respect. If you have a reputation for weakness, then people will pick on you. And we're going to end with Polybius again, because you come back to his statement about being interested in how did the Romans conquer, but not why. Why is obvious. The Romans conquered because they could, just as the Macedonians had conquered in the past because they could. And Athens had conquered because it could. This is the ancient world. It is a much more brutal and warlike place. There is a willingness to go to war for far less cause than we would consider legitimate in the modern world. So this is the ancient world. It's a place where people are far more ready to go to war than we would be today, at least perception is of developed countries, that you need a good pretext and war should be a last resort. Wars happened a lot more frequently in the ancient world. They were much more common, and a lot of them were about plunder and status. It's all about asserting yourself. And in a sense, it's almost like the political system at Rome, where how you are perceived, how important you are, what your auctoritas is, determines how others will treat you, whether they'll ask you for favors, whether they'll treat you with respect, or whether they'll see you as vulnerable and someone they might be able to take down and build up their own reputation. Things work in quite a similar way in broader international affairs. And there are more wars. However, there is not constant, unrelenting conflict. This is a rarity. There are big wars, there are frequent wars on some of the areas, but even if you look and say, well, the Romans governor of further Spain, often there are conflicts there, people end up winning victories, they end up with triumphs. It isn't always against the same people. In these areas where you have lots of different tribes, communities, clans, leaders, you can fight wars in the same area but against different people. And this is something you can see in more detail when you come on to Caesar's accounts in Gaul, where some of the Gallic tribes never fight him at all, and plenty of them welcome him and try and ally with him, although they may change their mind later on. So it's not simple, and we need to consider all these different interpretations you've had over the years of what was going on with Roman imperialism. The mistake is to see any of it as inevitable, and while it's valuable to look at what's emphasized on the aspects of the Roman system, whether it's competition amongst the aristocracy, whether it's need for slaves, demand for land, money to buy up big estates, whether it's keeping the allies occupied and interested and involved in the state. These are factors and we need to consider them, but none of them gives a simple definitive answer and this is what it's all about. It's a lot more complicated than that. And again, coming back to the early point, it isn't just about the Romans. Even though we see it overwhelmingly from the Roman point of view, other people were involved in this. These conflicts were not all one-sided, they were not all caused by Rome. But the trend was, in the end, you come back to this, the Romans win more wars and they build up their power more effectively than anyone else. So the Roman Empire will be created and will turn increasingly into a territorial empire where they occupy more and more provinces. Now, some of why this happens is a theme we're going to develop next time when we look at expansion in the West. So with all of these talks, there are things that we discuss in one that will lead on to what we're doing in others, and it's worth remembering when we talk about these new issues. So that's it for this time. We've looked at these debates on Roman imperialism. We've tried to steer a course between them, tried to look at the merits and the weaknesses, some of them very significant, of some of these theories, and particularly some of the traditional ideas of how empires worked and why they were there. But that's a reminder. People at the time thought that this all made perfect sense. So just because we, from a different society, have a different perspective on this, others in the future will look back at us and will wonder why we're coming out with some ideas which to them seem crazy or seem completely illogical, or we miss what they would see as the obvious point. So you need to keep going back to the sources, keep asking as many questions and as many new questions as you possibly can, and challenge the orthodoxy. So we'll go on next time to imperialism in the West, and we'll still be dealing with many of these themes before our focus switches back more to Roman politics and the careers of the Gracchi and the lead into what will become Rome's political violence and civil wars. So that's the way we're going. But all of this is within the context of what the Romans are doing in the wider Mediterranean world and their gradual expansion. So that's it for today. Thanks.